Oh, now you've heard my story, so I'll be on my way. I hear a Frisco freight train, it's calling out to me. When the sun sinks in the west, in the dark sky, say that I'm a hobo, and I will be till I die. Yodelee, yodelee, yodelee.
It was a simpler time. For thousands of rural families scattered across the Midwest at the beginning of the 20th century, life could be lonely and bleak. Isolated by mud roads and far from neighbors, tied to a daily routine of hard, solitary labor, the prairie farmer was cut off from the world and a feeling of community. He read the seed catalog, shopped from Sears and Roebuck, and went to town on Saturday night. For the Midwest farmer, the coming of radio was like a miracle. A flood of signals filled the sky, opening a window on the world. Radio overcame the isolating effects of distance for rural families. Radio amplified the common values and the shared experience of life on the farm. Hungry for information and entertainment, the farmer and his family huddled over primitive crystal sets or crowded around battery-powered one-tube receivers, eagerly listening for the faint sounds from far away that traveled like magic through thin air.
Hello, friends. This is Earl May speaking to you by direct wire from San Francisco.
Thank you. Yes, it's Henry himself, and it's pretty chilly this morning.
Then, suddenly, in 1925, two new voices pierced the vapor, loud and clear. Farm listeners were introduced to Earl May and Henry Field, broadcasting from their brand new radio stations in Shenandoah, Iowa. Now, Earl and Henry weren't polished fancy talkers. They were just plain folks, more like neighbors who stopped by every day to visit.
Now, some of you might be wondering what kind of reports I'm going to give you. You might wonder what I'll be able to add to the competence coverage.
They brought today's news and tomorrow's weather, and the kind of good old-fashioned music that everybody liked. They had jokes for the kids, and recipes for the ladies, and plenty of good, sensible advice about farming. Like real neighbors, Earl and Henry invited everybody to come on over to Shenandoah and see their live radio shows. And what a show they put on. They had singers and fiddlers, hula girls and Spanish dancers, live elephants and alligators. There were parades and politicians and famous preachers like the Reverend Billy Sunday and Amy Semple McPherson. On their big Jubilee days, Earl and Henry tried to outdo each other with free pancakes and hot dogs. Earl and Henry invited everybody to come, and by the thousands, they came.
I always think of radio as a means of opening up the country. Back in those days, most of the people were on the farms, at least a large percentage of them were. The cars were not very good, the roads were not very good, and a radio gave them access to the outside world.
People were coming here from miles around. It was not unusual at all on a Sunday particularly, or in the summer when the farmers had the corn laid by and could take a vacation. The kids weren't in school yet, and they'd just load the kids in the flivver and away they'd come. Everybody wanted to go to Shenandoah. There wasn't much to see or do anywhere else, but Shenandoah had two radio stations, and they were very anxious to come here.
Born hucksters, these two competitors recognized the enormous potential of the new medium radio and used it with an enterprising flair and imagination to sell their nursery products to farmers and gardeners. But what began merely as an innovative way to expand the nursery business ended by leaving an indelible mark on the culture and the very character of the Midwest in the 20th century.
They were very good, dependable friends. I mean, you believed what they said. If he said this is the finest alfalfa seed available, you believed it. We came over and we bought it. And we bought tires, we bought batteries, we bought whatever they were telling us about that we believed it.
Both Earl May and Henry Field were very unusual. I've made the statement many times that it was like having two P.T. Barnums in the same town at the same time, each one trying to outdo the other.
By founding two of the earliest and most powerful radio stations in the Midwest, these two flamboyant promoters transformed a little country town into the seed and nursery capital of the world. Shenandoah, Iowa, incorporated in 1871, was named after the beautiful Virginia River Valley, which it resembled. The pioneer Lake brothers had already planted the first nursery fields along the fertile bottom of the Nishnabotna River. And by the early 1900s, Shenandoah was a trade center with 2 railroads, a population of 4,000, and a growing reputation as an important seed and nursery town. Young Henry Field established his own small seed business in 1902 at his Sleepy Hollow farm. Henry Field was born December 6, 1871, the son of pioneer school teachers and one of 7 children. Henry's career in the seed business began when he was only 6, sparked by a seed catalog and an avid interest in gardening. The ambitious Henry started selling his homegrown vegetables door to door, and before long, he discovered what his customers actually wanted was seed, so they could grow their own big, robust vegetables just like young Henry did. Well, by the age of 10, Henry had become a super salesman with a thriving seed business, and at age 15, he spent the winter working in the Livingston Seed Company in Des Moines, learning more about the trade. Eventually, Henry attended college, and like his parents, he became a country school teacher. But he continued to run his market wagon, selling vegetables and seeds, and soon his avid interest in horticulture blossomed into a passion. In 1899, he began publishing a 4-page catalog, which established his reputation throughout the region as a master seedsman. He built a small seed house behind his home at Sleepy Hollow in 1902 and concentrated his efforts on improving seed varieties and expanding sales. The Henry Field Seed Company was incorporated in 1907, and a large downtown seed house was built. By the 1920s, Fields ranked among the largest seed businesses in the nation. The Field mail-order catalog, with Henry's honest, raw-boned face on every cover, was standard reading in most farm homes. Henry also published and distributed a free pamphlet on gardening called Seed Sense. Henry's remarkable skill as a writer, photographer, publisher, and all-around self-promoter made him a well-known figure long before the public ever heard the sound of his voice. When Omaha radio station WOAW invited Henry to provide an evening broadcast in 1923, he rounded up all the seed house employees who could sing or play and presented 2 hours of old-fashioned fiddling and hymn singing and ended the program with a talk by Henry himself.
The amount of stuff that can be raised on just
After more than 5,000 letters poured in, Henry knew he had found a good thing. With his keen sense of promotion, Henry realized that radio could be the ideal instrument to publicize his company and sell its products. Undaunted by the high cost of commercially built transmitters, Henry drafted his friend Harley Bartles and several other local radio amateurs to build a homemade 500-watt radio station with old windmill parts and baling wire and a gas generator. These hometown innovators put together a working transmitter, and Henry said later, "We had the darndest rig that ever was, but it worked."
They operated on entirely Willard storage batteries. And Henry'd be on a while, and then they begin fading out, and he'd say, "Well, folks," he says, "the operators comes in and tell me they got to charge the batteries up." He says, "You leave your dial set right where it's at, and we'll be back in about 10 minutes. And pretty soon he'd come on, boom. Pretty soon he'd fade out again.
On February 22, 1924, KFNF Radio was born, bringing Henry's plain, friendly voice and folksy advice to farm families across the Midwest. From Kansas to the Dakotas, farmers and ranchers welcomed Henry as a wise and wonderful new friend who spoke their language and shared their interests. Without ever leaving the makeshift studio on the 3rd floor of the Field building, Henry was able to visit with thousands of prospective customers each day. Adopting the same approach he used in his Seed Sense magazine, Henry simply offered tips, advice, and knowledge from his remarkable reservoir of gardening experience.
Sure, and plant some. Plant real early when you do your lettuce and radishes. Handle it just the same way. Plant in rows and then thin it out to about a foot apart. About a couple of inches
Mail
apart
poured in
the
daily
row,
applauding the KFNF programming, which included religious services and live performances by a variety of amateur musicians and office employees who formed singing groups called the Cornfield Canaries and the Seed House Girls. But the centerpiece of the KFNF broadcast was Henry's noontime letter basket when he answered listener mail. And of course, every letter became a new address for the field catalog.
Or you can buy either kind separate. You'll find them described and priced on page 21. We have other, if you want big melons, an awful good...
I remember once Uncle Henry said to Mother when she started broadcasting, and I don't know, the fields always got together for Thanksgiving. Oh, you know, I mean, there'd be dozens of people there. And he said, Leanna, one thing you must always remember when you're broadcasting, keep your hands in the dishwater. That is, keep close to your people. You know, do it yourself, tell them about it, but this is as close as you can be, is just remember, keep your hands in the dishwater.
Farm friends of mine from the area where I came from looked at Henry basically as a real savior. They trusted him explicitly. If Henry got on the air and said that I've got some sweet clover seed here that tests such and such, you ought to plant it on your farm, they would rush down here or to a Henry Field store and they would buy it. He had utmost confidence of people. They believed in him, they trusted in him.
KFNF helped boost the Henry Field Seed Company to a new level of success. The year before KFNF signed on the air, field sales totaled $900,000. By 1927, that figure grew to a surprising $2.5 million. Henry boasted that the field company accounted for half the town's annual postal receipts. Meanwhile, another Shenandoah entrepreneur, Earl E. May, had been eyeing the success of the field company. In 1919, young Earl, with the help of his father-in-law, founded the Earl May Seed and Nursery Company. Now, Earl May was 19 years younger than Henry Field. In many respects, the two men were strikingly different. Yet, in many ways, they were also remarkably similar. Born near Hayes Center in western Nebraska on March 21, 1890, Earl Ernest May was the son of pioneer rancher Richard May and his wife Rosa. Earl's driving ambition also surfaced at an early age, but his passion was for law, not seeds. Earl salvaged hides, and he trapped animals and hunted wolves and even raised turkeys to build his college fund. For a while, Earl supported himself as a country school teacher, and at age 20 he became the principal of Hayes Center High School. But determined to be a lawyer, he entered the University of Michigan in 1911. It was during his time in Michigan that Earl got a job as a traveling salesman with the D.M. Ferry Seed Company, perhaps the largest catalog seed operation at the time. Riding horseback from hamlet to hamlet, taking seed orders and making collections, Earl spent much of his time visiting directly with customers and farmers. And he quickly learned what kind of talk the Midwesterners liked: sincere, honest, and straightforward. After the sudden death of his father, Earl returned to Nebraska and enrolled in the university at Lincoln. And there he met Gertrude Welch of Shenandoah, Iowa, who became his bride. Earl's marriage was fortuitous in more ways than one, for Gertrude's father was E.S. Welch, owner of the highly successful Mount Arbor Nursery, and one of the most highly respected figures in the field of horticulture. Forsaking his dreams of a career in law, Earl decided to join Mount Arbor instead. And he quickly learned the wholesale nursery business from his father-in-law, the Dean of American Nurserymen. Eventually, he convinced Mr. Welch that there was room for another mail-order seed business in town. With the blessing and financial backing of his father-in-law, Earl established his own firm, the May Seed Company. The first 5 years were lean. However, impressed by Earl's determination and vitality, Welch continued to invest in the promising new business, and in 1924, the Earl May Seed Company finally turned a small profit. Like David and Goliath, the tiny Earl May Company and the giant Henry Field Company competed in the old-fashioned mail-order seed catalog business. Neither anticipated the profound change that was just beginning to sweep the country. Suddenly, almost overnight, radio broadcasts began flooding the sky.
Brought to you by the millers of Mother's Best Flour, with Marge Parker at the studio organ.
A gold rush atmosphere pervaded the radio industry when Henry Field and Earl May tested the waters of this newfangled technology. The rules were being written and unwritten daily, and no one had a clear idea of how a radio station was supposed to operate. Well, it was an ideal situation for those inclined to invent solutions and answers as they went along. In other words, radio was perfect for Earl May and Henry Field. By this time, one of the most powerful stations in the vicinity was WOAW in Omaha, operated by the Woodmen of the World, a fraternal organization and insurance company. At that time, broadcasting phonograph records over the air violated copyright laws. So consequently, most radio programming was strictly live. Radio stations like WOAW were constantly searching for local talent, especially if it came free. Radio stations didn't have to look far. Every church choir and glee club within 60 miles of Omaha began to practice with extra enthusiasm. Ministers prepared inspirational sermons. Piano players polished their cadenzas, and fiddlers rosined up their bows. And it seemed that everybody wanted to be on the radio. Several groups from the Shenandoah area, including Henry Field and the Seed House Gang, were making the 60-mile trip to Omaha regularly. Meanwhile, Earl May witnessed the tremendous response to WOAW broadcasts, and he began organizing broadcasts of his own. Being a member of the Woodmen of the World, Earl already had a foot in the door. On the evening of January 17, 1924, Earl May convened the first World Radio Camp of the Woodmen of the World, which included a regular business meeting, followed by several solos by Earl's employees and friends, including his wife Gertrude. Despite the ban on direct advertising, Earl offered to send free iris bulbs to the first 10,000 people who mailed in cards. Over 17,800 listeners, some as far away as California, telephoned or telegrammed messages in response to the first broadcast by the Earl May Seed Company. Earl's broadcast immediately became a monthly event. In June 1924, WOAW announced that Earl May would begin broadcasting from his own studio in Shenandoah, which would be connected to Omaha by a special phone line. But Earl was not content to trail in the footsteps of Henry Field. Proclaiming that radio is the greatest factor in modern life today, Earl received a license to operate a radio station of his own. Earl's radio station, KMA, took to the air on August 1925 with a newly installed Western Electric 500-watt Class B transmitter set up in the company's seed house.
Earl May Seed Company, distributors of triple-tested garden seeds and high-quality nursery stock. This is KMA in Shenandoah, Iowa.
For Henry Field, well established in the seed and nursery business, radio was just an interesting venture that could help promote greater sales. For the tiny Earl May Company, radio was a big gamble. It meant success or nothing. But Earl May had a keen sense for taking the right risk at the right time.
He was a man who had great foresight, and he looked into the future and saw a great many things that I'm sure Mr. Field never thought about. Earl wanted to make it big, always wanted to make it big, and he did.
Kicking off the first week of official programming on September 1st, 1925, for the dedication of KMA Radio, no less than 175 performers went before the May studio microphones. Included were vocalists Floyd and Jesse Young, Orma Carmi, the How Do You Do Boys, the Municipal Band, May's Mandolins, and Walt Nixon's new Delmonica Hotel Orchestra. Shenandoah Mayor H.E. Dieter and others talked on everything from community betterment to flower arranging. Before long, Earl adopted the KMA slogan, "The Corn Belt Station in the Heart of the Nation."
And he was right out among them, and so was Mr. May. Mr. May had a habit of, he came to work dressed up with his tie and his coat and everything. First thing he did was take off his coat and sling that in the corner, and then he'd roll up his sleeves, you know, with those starched cuffs. And I can see him yet with he was ready for business. When he came out with his sleeves rolled up, something was going to happen. And he'd jump up and get on the air. If they were playing some music that kind of got to him, you know, he'd get up on the stage and talk to the musicians and kiddle around with them a little bit.
He was one of the biggest promoters in the country. Sometimes he'd try to promote too much, I think, because we would be there to play a program, and he'd advertise a while, garden sage or sell harness or paint or coffee, anything that they had. They had their own coffee brand, their own paint brand and all that. And he would get started talking, and he'd talk for an hour and a half, and he'd say, well, we'll have Ruby's on here in just a moment now to play a tune. We never played a tune during the whole program. He'd talk the whole program, maybe.
For the rural and small-town population of the Midwest, many of them recent immigrants barely accustomed to the changes brought by the automobile, KFNF and KMA forever changed the quality of life. To listeners out on the Dakota homestead, the Nebraska ranch, the hardscrabble farm in Missouri, or at the tail end of a mud road in Iowa, Earl May and Henry Field were trusted friends who came right into the house and sat down and started talking.
I think it helped band the farmers together. They were so interested, and they thought, well, here is a place where we can be heard, and we can do our thing, and people will listen. And they felt like this was their station, and it really was. The Friendly Farmer Station, KFNF, keep friends never fail, kind friends never fail. They had all kinds of things that they called this, and the seeds that yield are sold by field. And we had all kinds of slogans. And the farmers, they believed that. It was said sincerely, and they swallowed it. And it helped encourage them and keep them going.
That was what we looked forward to. The first thing in the morning, Dad would tune the old radio up, and the rooster would crow, and we'd hear somebody talking about what the weather was going to be and so forth. It was Bible. I mean, they taught us everything we needed. And I think anybody would tell you, anybody of my vintage would tell you, that radio probably next to the family was the most important thing in their life.
Live radio was spontaneous. It was sincere. And there was feeling in the songs that the entertainers sang. Great feeling. And there was emotion at times, too. But it was the feeling that you had, and we were providing a valuable service to the farmers and also to the city people, plus the fact that we were entertaining them. We have to keep in mind that back in those days there was no TV. The only additional entertainment was generated by folks if they went to homes and had parties, or if they went to the movies. And so you provided a source of entertainment for the people.
Both stations became extremely popular, delivering a daily dose of exciting new ideas in a kaleidoscope of comedy, music, religion, and tips on everything from gardening to domestic science, but most especially on farming and the weather. Within a year, the mail response from listeners in Radio Land was so enormous that Henry Field took a surprising second in a national contest sponsored by the Radio Digest, the TV guide of its day. The following year, both Henry Field and Earl May were favorites among the 129 contenders for the prize, a gold cup reportedly worth $5,000. But Henry, in a typical show of cooperation, withdrew from the contest and urged listeners to support Earl May instead. And Earl, with his affable informality and hearty laugh from Little Shenandoah, Iowa, garnered over 450,000 votes to win the coveted gold cup in 1926. Prompted by the outpouring of mail from all over the Midwest, it was only natural for the two radio promoters to wonder how far their signals could go. And like kids with new toys, they fired up the power, and Henry Field said, on a good clear night, we could pour on the kilowatts and tear a hole across the Midwest. KMA followed suit with an all-night broadcast at peak power in an effort to reach Australia. As a result, listeners responded to the stations from all 48 states, Canada, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Alaska, even ships at sea. Finally, a letter came from another station located in Melbourne, Australia. Not everyone looked upon these bold Shenandoah men as heroes and stars. Fellow Iowan and Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover branded these frequency jumpers and power boosters air pirates, and he singled out fellow Iowans Henry Field and Earl May as prime examples of what he meant. By the time federal regulation ended these heady experiments in power boosting, Earl and Henry were known from coast to coast and had thousands of names on their catalog mailing lists.
Buy either kind separate. You'll find them described and priced on page 21. We have other, if you want big melons, an awful good one.
Most people who recall these two visionaries remember Henry as the innovator, usually the first to try new ideas. But if Earl was a few footsteps behind, it was he who is most commonly credited with developing new concepts to their greatest potential. After KMA was on the air only a few short weeks, Earl realized that farmers wanted more than entertainment. Having seen lights dot the landscape on early morning drives to WOAW in Omaha, Earl figured that the farmer would like to hear weather, news, and market information before starting his chores outside. In the fall of 1925, KMA became the first radio station in the nation to broadcast in the early morning hours.
KMA, in my estimation, placed more emphasis upon news, and they had probably a little different type of entertainment than KFNF. Henry's philosophy was old-time religion and fiddling, and out of that grew his country music, and Henry loved gospel music. And of course he loved old-time fiddling too. Men like Wilbur Smith that could really play that fiddle, and Buck Dilley, my goodness, they could make those fiddles almost talk.
It was Henry who came up with the biggest promotion scheme that Shenandoah would ever see. To show his appreciation to the thousands of listeners who had made his seed nursery company the largest in the nation, Henry threw a party to observe KFNF's second anniversary in February 1926. That celebration attracted 10,000 out-of-town guests traveling by train or over dirt roads to Shenandoah. They were entertained with 36 straight hours of radio broadcasts featuring over 100 old-time fiddlers and pickers and singers. They were given studio tours, and best of all, were treated to free hot dogs. This gala party was to be the first of a long series of annual celebrations called Jubilees. Earl was quick to counter with a celebration of his own. Bigger and better, of course. When Earl won the Radio Digest contest later in 1926, he promised listeners a grand celebration, and that he would personally fry flapjacks for all who would come. And he kept his promise, and during the first 3 days of November 1926, KMA held its first Jubilee. The station was on the air non-stop from Monday through Wednesday, and Earl and his boys fried 53,000 flapjacks.
The Jubilees were something that shouldn't have been successful, but were successful. They gave away tons of food. They'd have pancakes, free pancakes. They'd have free hot dogs. Well, there were just millions of people, it seemed like, in this town when that would take place. Took a lot of planning, and they didn't spare the horses. They had the big tents up, and the food was rolling, and the feeling, you can't imagine the feeling. And there was music everywhere.
In addition to the usual performers and speakers, there were special appearances by the Pleasure Palace Orchestra from the Brandeis Department Store Tea Room in Omaha and the Southland Jubilee Singers from Mississippi. There were also the popular Dixie Girls from Oklahoma City. People descended on Shenandoah from all over the Midwest. They camped in the city park, rented rooms in private homes, and slept in their cars.
Our hotel was, we maybe had 2 hotels then, but they were all full. So the natives would just rent out the bedrooms. The kids could sleep on the floor one night, and we'll rent your room out to the tourists. So I can remember being newly married, and our brother-in-law came up and he said, "We want to borrow all the sheets you had." And I said, "Oh, my sheets were wedding presents." "Well, that doesn't matter. We want to borrow them for our tourists. We're going to fill our house up with tourists tonight and make a killing in one night." So we let him have them.
On the first day of the Jubilee, 6,100 people visited the Seed House and the studio, and most of them had a taste of what were to become the trademark of KMA Jubilees for years to come, free pancakes. The Jubilees brought people to town by the tens of thousands. They came to show the best of their crops, fruits and vegetables, chickens, eggs, ears of corn or flowers. At May's, they took part in contests like nail driving, egg throwing, husband calling, potato peeling, and pancake eating. Earl May challenged them to milking contests, and Earl seldom lost. Competitions at KFNF centered on a variety of musical skills, especially fiddling and playing the harmonica or accordion. And of course, fans consumed a staggering amount of free food.
It was a big event because coming to Shenandoah to see live talent, to see these people that you were hearing on the radio every day, was quite a thrill for them. And of course, the entertainers would get out and mingle among them and visit with them, and the folks enjoyed this too. But they is what Henry would call salt of the earth, people that were the salt of the earth.
Mr. May would have a platform out in front of his place. Mr. Field would have one at his. And out back, there was a place at Mr. Field's where we'd go out back and do some playing and picking and singing and so forth. And he was right out among them, and so was Mr. May.
The throngs of people brought out politicians. Many spoke over the radio or from platforms set up near the studios. Governors, congressmen, and officials from the Department of Agriculture almost always appeared when these farm-oriented stations entertained. Before long, crowds came to expect variety and excitement.
And I can remember one Jubilee time, about 3 houses up from Henry Field's. This right in the middle of the day, this house blew up, and everybody was so excited about it, and they thought how wonderful it was with this giant explosion blowing a house off the face of the earth, because all for this entertainment. And lo and behold, it was an old fellow that had a still down the basement, and it blew up on him. Fortunately, he wasn't home at the time, but that's how excited we were.
Just everyday entertainment.
Yes, an explosion like that was part of the entertainment.
Fired by the wild success of the Jubilees and bursting with more ideas, Henry and Earl never lost sight of radio's ability to sell their products. They began to expand their mail-order inventories to include all varieties of farm supplies and a host of other items. They sold everything from overalls to tires. In one season, 80 train car loads of perishable food, grapefruit, bananas, celery, grapes, frozen fish, and oranges were snapped up by listeners who heard them advertised on KMA and KFNF. People said that a stranger could find his way to Shenandoah by the trail of orange peels.
If he took a brick off the pavement and held it up on the radio and started telling you of the good qualities of it, you would soon be convinced that was a solid gold brick, and you wanted to buy part of it.
Henry, with self-styled Missouri English delivery on the air, seemed to hold an edge over Earl as the super salesman. Henry actually sold a whole train car load of hams to farmers, most of whom raised hogs. But this legendary feat of salesmanship was topped by Earl May when he found himself stuck with an entire train car load of prunes. Earl put out the message to his homemakers and announcers, "Push prunes." Bernice Courier became the prune heroine of KMA. During the following weeks, her listeners heard recipes for prune pie, prune salad, prune pudding, and prune rolls. Before Bernice was through, everyone in the state of Iowa had become regular.
They'd order a great big shipment of something. One time Earl May ordered Bogota coffee, a whole railroad car full of Bogota coffee. Have you ever tasted Bogota coffee? It's like liquid licorice. It was just, I thought, just awful. But the farmers came in and they bought the whole schmear. Well, he quit doing that, see, and he'd order grapefruit that way. And one time, Mr. Field ordered a whole railroad car full of bananas on the stalk. And Dad said, my father said, when we came over here at that time, and he said, it looks like a jungle out there. And all these banana skins coming out of the car windows. And it was funny.
In addition to wild feats of salesmanship, both radio stations began to feature all kinds of innovative promotions. At one time, KFNF staged a mass wedding with 14 couples. But disaster nearly ensued when one couple failed to show, leaving an unlucky 13 couples for the ceremony. One of the most popular stunts was the flagpole sitter, a man who sat atop the KFNF radio tower for several weeks.
The exciting part for me was they always had a man come and sit up on top of KFNF's tower, and he would spend a week up there. And being a young lad, that worried me, that man up there. And well, every night when Dad would come home from work, I'd ask him, he's still up there, and how's he doing? And there were several other questions that I wondered about that guy up there for a week, but I didn't dare ask. And as you might imagine.
I especially remember when they had the flagpole setter down at the tower, and when it was raining, he'd sell raincoats, you know, and man, he was perfectly comfortable because he was wearing a raincoat, you know, that they sold at the seed house and things like that.
Despite these zany publicity stunts, integrity was the key to their salesmanship. Both Earl and Henry stood behind their products, and the people knew they could trust them. Satisfaction guarantees were published in every catalog and always promised on the radio. But the meteoric rise in the popularity of KFNF and KMA didn't stop with the Jubilees. In Henry's words, it was only natural that people wanted to see firsthand and meet those individuals whose voices they learned to recognize on the radio. In February 1927, he announced that he would build an auditorium for KFNF. Citing the fact that 40,000 people had visited the preceding year, he envisioned a broadcasting studio spacious enough to accommodate a large crowd. Naturally, a few months later, Earl May announced the construction of the KMA auditorium. The KFNF and KMA auditoriums were a study in contrasts. Nowhere were the differences in temperament between Henry and Earl more clearly expressed. In typical Field fashion, Henry assembled his seat house employees and a few local carpenters, paced off the dimensions, and told them to construct a simple, roomy, stucco building in the Spanish mission style which was fashionable in the 20s. Inside, the audience sat in sturdy church pews. The centerpiece was a pipe organ dedicated in memory of Henry's wife, Edna, and funded by contributions from listeners after her death in 1925. When rumors circulated that the KFNF auditorium had cost $40,000 to build, Henry was quick to deny that he had spent anything like that. Well, exotic as Henry's Spanish building seemed, it was soon eclipsed by the construction of the KMA auditorium. Earl engaged the services of Omaha architects, no locals for Earl May, to design an auditorium on the scale of the elaborate movie palaces being constructed in the more populous cities at that time. The KMA auditorium would seat 900 on the ground floor, 100 in the balcony, and would cost $100,000 to construct. True to his nature, Earl planned for it to be the largest and most beautiful radio hall between the Mississippi and the Rocky Mountains. The lavish design was based on a Moorish motif, replete with minarets. An enormous 3-ton sheet of glass, 24 feet long, could be raised and lowered on stage to create a sound studio.
It was gorgeous. It was done in a Spanish style, and every so often along the walls they'd have little niches where there'd be a beautiful urn and some artificial flowers, gorgeously painted, and then the ceiling was a navy blue, so it seemed to me, and it had stars twinkling. And then there would be clouds coming out. And then in front of you, above the stage, were these doves they had suspended in the air. And it was just a fairy tale to me, and just gorgeous. And then I'd sit there, and the entertainers would come on, and just took me into another world.
Unlike the Fields building, which was simply called the KFNF Auditorium, the May building was so special it rated a name, the Mayfair. Such a grand setting also rated a higher class of entertainment. Earl began to hire professionals, exotic dancers, musicians from the Chautauqua circuit.
And Earl May, like I say, he had the money. He booked in a lot of Chautauqua programs, you know. People have been on Chautauqua. And he had the Gypsy Trio, which was a man playing the guitar and a lady playing the violin and another lady playing the piano. Then we had the Applesauce Twins, Doc Bellamy and Grady Ford, to get up there with a lot of silly stuff. So we just had just about everything.
It was on the air, but there was something about being there. People made friends out of the auditorium there, you know. We could see all this happening. Now, I wish the kids today could know the sincerity and the hard work that went into it. We were a sincere group.
Over at Fields, radio was always more of a family affair. Sister Jessie Shambaugh, the 4-H originator, talked about education. And Sister Helen Field Fisher was the flower expert. Sister Leanna Driftmeyer had her famous kitchen clatter program. Son Frank Field gave the weather. Brother Saul advertised his California land development, and the kids sold lemonade and popcorn. With his 5 sisters and his 11 children, Henry had quite a staff. But as much as conservative Iowans admired Henry Field's frugal ways and do-it-yourself independence, it was Earl May's $100,000 theater that they flocked to see. Both May's and Field's theaters were packed daily with visitors who came to hear their favorite performers and to see Earl and Henry in the flesh. With the Jubilees and the broadcasts bringing well over 100,000 people to Shenandoah each year, it was only natural that the next expansion would come in retailing. In the 1929 Seed Sense catalog, Henry invited his friends to come and see us anytime. He told them about the new arcade connecting KFNF with the main seed building. Henry had come up with another first, the first shopping mall in the area. The golden arches of the Field building, pictured on thousands of postcards and advertisements mailed all over the U.S., became as familiar to Midwesterners as the arches of McDonald's are today. The Field building housed a hardware store, a grocery store, and a cafe. And shoppers could find clothing for the whole family, car batteries, harnesses, paint, binder twine, cosmetics, and of course radios. In the pet department, they could buy tropical fish and canaries that had actually sung over the radio in Field's famous canary choir. Across the street was Field's oil station, which sold Henry Field brand tires and gave 5 gallons of free gas with every $20 order from the seed house. In nearby buildings were the fur buying station and the Field hatchery, which sold baby chicks, brooder stoves, and incubators. And if one could find an empty seat in the auditorium, the entertainment was free from morning until evening. And Henry Field tourist cabins were open for those who wanted to spend the night. Earl kept up with the competition, installing shops in his seed house too. But radio advertising was Earl's real strength. Canny promoter that he was, he put the May name before the public at every opportunity. Listeners heard about Mayway Chicks, May Gold Corn, Mayworth Seeds, the Mayfair Theater, the Mayflower Trio, the May Tire Orchestra, and May's mandolin musicians. By 1930, Earl's brilliant use of radio advertising had put May Seed Company on an equal footing with the giant Field firm.
And, of course, then we listened daily to Henry Fields and Mays to see what was going on at the seed houses, which shipments they were getting in today. If they were getting in their grapefruits and oranges, we immediately made plans to drive over in our Model A car and get a load of oranges and grapefruit to take home. Of course, we always bought something else too. We bought our chickens here. They had hatcheries. We bought our chickens, and we bought our potatoes, our seed potatoes. We bought alfalfa seed. We bought everything.
The early days of radio in the 1920s were full of wild innovation and rampant growth. But events of the next decade brought a more sobering attitude to the industry. As the Great Depression spread like wildfire, farmers watched the price of corn drop to 12 cents a bushel. Farmers continued to listen to radio, but they didn't buy. When the nation's banks closed in 1930, panic-stricken farmers were desperate to buy seed for spring planting. Earl May, bolstered by his father-in-law, boldly took to the airways with a ray of hope.
Well, the May Seed Company had the seed to sell, so my father went on the radio and said time and again that, now, you people out there, you farmers, you need seed, but you have no money. Your money's tied up in the banks. We have the seed. And he said, I have full confidence that most of these banks are going to reopen. So you go ahead and order your seed, send your check. I will hold that check, and then when your bank reopens, we will make it good. In the meantime, of course, we will send you your seed.
Nearly $50,000 in checks rolled in, more than enough to bankrupt the Earl May Company. But when the banks reopened, Earl's faith was repaid. More than 98% of the checks proved to be good.
It shows that people are basically honest, and this was what my father had always said, that 98% of the people are basically honest.
Earl May possessed an uncanny business ability that enabled him to take large but calculated risks at crucial points in his career, risks that paid off. In contrast, Henry was, first and foremost, a devoted horticulturist whose real life work was developing new strains of flowers, vegetables, and his famous seed corn hybrids. For Henry, business matters were just a sideline. His generous, trusting nature and his indifferent attitude toward money put the field company in a financial crunch when hard times came following the stock market collapse in 1929.
No one had any money, and they didn't make big money, but somehow that group, they took care of each other. And maybe some of that taking care of each other, like the grocery store and the trading that went on among people and that, Henry Field probably should have been a very rich man, but because maybe some of the things like a little too much trading and generosity and the way things worked kind of behind the scenes kept him from being a rich man. But I think he was the kind of man that was very, very happy the way he was.
You see, they didn't have the attitude, the normal attitude towards money. Money was kept in a drawer, and anyone was welcome to help themselves to it. Anyone in the family or anyone that was living with them at the time being, because they took many elderly relatives and raised 2 other orphan children besides their own family of 7 fields.
By 1931, the field company was forced to reorganize. Although Henry continued as titular head and popular spokesman for the firm, he had lost control of the business that he had founded 40 years earlier. Henry kept the radio station, but it was eventually sold off and operated under various owners in succeeding years. The last sale in 1977 saw the end of the familiar call letters KFNF in Shenandoah. Earl May, with his solid financial backing, weathered most of the Great Depression. But in 1939, after a decade of economic woes, Earl sold 25% interest in KMA to the Palmer Broadcasting Company in Davenport, Iowa. Earl May continued his highly successful broadcasting career until his sudden death in 1946. By that time, his son Ed May, already a seasoned veteran of the air, was able to take his father's place at the mic and continue to build a family tradition in the broadcast field. Henry Field died in 1949 at the age of 78. Although he had lost control of the Henry Field Seed Company and had witnessed the decline of KFNF's fortunes, because of his unsurpassed generosity and common sense likability, his friends numbered in the thousands. Radio's golden era died at this time too, not only in Shenandoah, but around the nation. World War II and advanced technology brought its demise when recorded music replaced live itinerant musicians. The fiddlers and singers, the on-the-air jokes and chatter gave way to syndicated programs with disembodied voices. Henry Field and Earl May were true trailblazers. These legendary seedsmen, promoters, and broadcasters left a remarkable legacy. They brought more than just entertainment, news, and information into the homes of working people. They brought new immigrants into the mainstream of American life. They celebrated the virtues of honesty, integrity, fairness, and friendliness that are the roots of a way of life common to rural and small-town America. For a time, Earl May and Henry Field, with their bands of entertainers and homemakers, their jubilees and contests, their seed stores and catalogs, and most of all, with their reliable, trustworthy voices, transcended distance and loneliness and isolation. They were hucksters, promoters, extraordinary salesmen. But there were also much more. They struck a chord in the heart of the Midwest that still reverberates today. At the height of their glory, Earl May and Henry Field filled the silent air with voices that spoke across the continent to the soul of a nation.
Of me and my sorrow, I'll get by, don't you cry over me. No, don't shed any tears, they'll be wasted. Try and smile, dear, when I set you free. Though you know that my heart will be breaking, I'll get by, don't you cry over me.
Give the world a smile each day, helping someone on life's way. From the paths of sin, bring the wanderers into the Master's fold to stay.
Help to cheer the lone and sad, help to make some pilgrim glad. Let your life so be that all the world may see the joy of serving Jesus with a smile. Are you giving to the world a smile, helping lessen someone's dreary mile? Do you greet the world with song as through life you pass along, cheering those whom you may meet along life's way?
Give the world a smile each day, helping someone on life's way.